My first season working alone at a remote ranger station in the northern district of Idaho's Selway, Bitterroot Wilderness was supposed to be quiet, which is exactly why the Forest Service sends people there alone in the first place. Because most days the job is just long hours of monitoring weather logs, checking trail reports, and occasionally hiking out to clear fallen branches from a path that only a handful of backpackers might use in a whole week. And the station itself sat in a small clearing carved into a sea of thick pine and cedar that stretched for miles in every direction, with the nearest paved road nearly 40 miles away. Meaning that once the supply helicopter left every 2 weeks, the only sounds I usually heard at night were the wind in the trees and the distant rush of the Selway River somewhere beyond the hills. The building itself was a squat log structure, built in the 1930s, with a metal roof that popped loudly when the temperature dropped after sunset, and behind it stood an old radio mast and a small tool shed where we kept chainsaws, fuel, and emergency equipment. And when I first arrived in early August, the previous ranger had told me that the isolation would feel strange for the first few days, but eventually I'd get used to it, because the forest had a rhythm to it that made even complete silence feel normal. Once you knew what belonged there and what didn't, and for the first week, that advice seemed completely true because nothing unusual happened at all. Just the usual routine of morning patrol hikes, checking the trailhead logbooks for visitor entries, and recording daily weather data before the afternoon thunderstorms rolled through the mountains. But on the 8th night, something happened that began as such a small detail that I almost ignored it entirely. Because sometime after midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of gravel shifting on the narrow dirt road that led to the station. Which wasn't impossible, since occasionally lost campers would stumble onto that road while trying to navigate the backcountry. But what made the sound strange was how slow and deliberate it seemed. Like tires rolling quietly without an engine running. And when I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight, the clearing was empty, except for the dark wall of trees and the long stretch of pale road disappearing between them. Yet the dust hanging in the air suggested something had just passed through moments earlier. The next morning, while doing my routine check of the perimeter, I noticed fresh tire tracks on the road about 50 yards from the station entrance, where someone had apparently stopped and turned around in the dirt before heading back the way they came, which bothered me immediately because the station gate had been closed and locked the previous evening, and the only vehicles with access to that road were Forest Service trucks that would have radioed ahead before arriving. So I walked down to inspect the gate, expecting to find it broken or forced open. But instead, it was still chained, exactly as I had left it. And that meant whoever drove up there must have parked outside the barrier and walked the remaining distance on foot, sometime during the night. I tried to convince myself it was just a late hiker looking for help or directions, but the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed, because the station porch light had been on all night, and anyone approaching would have easily seen that someone was inside. Yet whoever came close enough to leave those tire tracks hadn't knocked on the door or called out for assistance. And for the rest of that day, the forest seemed unusually quiet as I hiked to nearby trails checking for signs of campers, though I didn't encounter a single person anywhere along the valley. That evening I logged the tire tracks in the daily report and radioed the district office just in case someone had been traveling through the area unofficially. But they confirmed that no scheduled patrols had been near my station a previous night, which meant the visitor had either been a lost traveler who turned around quickly, or someone who didn't want to be seen at all. And I remember standing on the porch after sunset, listening to the wind and sand, the trees, and feeling that faint unease you get when something about the wilderness feels just slightly off, like the forest itself is holding its breath. 2 nights later, the same thing happened again, except this time I heard the sound earlier in the evening, just after dusk, while I was writing reports inside. A faint crunch of gravel, followed by what sounded unmistakably like a vehicle door closing somewhere down the road beyond the clearing. And I turned off the interior light so I could see outside more clearly through the window. But the darkness between the trees was too thick to reveal anything beyond the reach of the porch light. And for nearly 10 minutes, I stood there listening for footsteps or voices, while the forest remained completely silent. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the road toward the gate, expecting to find someone stranded or needing directions. But when I reached the bend where the road curved through the trees, I saw no vehicle anywhere. Only the same dusty ground with a fresh pair of tire tracks leading right up to the edge of the clearing before turning around again, as if the driver had approached just far enough to look at the station before leaving. That pattern repeated itself 3 more times over the following week, always at night, and always without anyone actually approaching the building. And each time the tracks would appear in roughly the same place, like the driver was stopping at exactly the same distance from the porch light before backing out and disappearing down the road. Eventually, the situation began to weigh on my mind in a way that made the quiet nights feel different. Because instead of the forest being empty, it started to feel like someone was nearby, just beyond the trees, observing the station from a distance. And the first truly unsettling discovery happened one morning, when I walked out to the tool shed behind the building and noticed the door hanging slightly open, even though I distinctly remembered locking it the previous evening. And inside the shed, everything looked untouched at first, except for one small detail. On the workbench where a cigarette butt had been crushed into the dust, even though neither I nor the previous ranger smoked, and no one else had been officially at that station for weeks. The cigarette itself still smelled faintly fresh, like it had been left there only hours earlier, which meant that sometime during the night while I slept inside the station, someone had walked around the back of the building and entered the shed without making enough noise to wake me. And realizing that made my skin crawl, because the distance between the shed and my bedroom window was barely 15 feet. I radioed the district office again that afternoon and reported the incident. But since no equipment had been stolen and there were still no confirmed sightings of a vehicle, they told me to simply keep the doors locked and report any further activity, which is standard protocol for remote stations because sometimes people wander through the wilderness and do strange things without actually committing a crime. Yet the reassurance did little to calm the feeling that someone had been deliberately approaching the station only when I wasn't looking. The following night, I stayed awake longer than usual, with the exterior lights on, sitting at the desk by the window, listening to the forest while pretending to finish paperwork. And around 1:30 in the morning, I finally heard something again, except this time it wasn't a vehicle, but a soft tapping sound coming from the wooden wall behind the cabin. Too was me. The sound came once, and paused for several seconds, then came again, slightly lower on the wall, as if whoever was outside was testing whether I would respond. And every instinct told me not to open the door. So instead, I quietly stepped onto the porch with my flashlight and scanned the clearing, but there was no one visible anywhere near the building. However, as I walked around the side of the station, the beam of the flashlight caught something reflecting faintly in the dirt, about 10 yards from the back wall. And when I approached, I realized it was another cigarette butt, still glowing slightly at the tip, as though it had been dropped only moments earlier. Whoever left it had been standing in the shadows beside the cabin, listening to me move around inside. And judging by the warmth of the ash, they must have slipped away into the forest only seconds before I stepped outside. Which meant that for several minutes I had been alone in the darkness, with someone who was close enough to hear my footsteps through the wooden floor. After that night, I started locking every door and window before sunset, and keeping the radio within arm's reach while I slept. But the visits didn't stop, because over the next week, I kept finding new tire tracks appearing near the clearing, even on nights when I never heard a vehicle at all. And once I even noticed a set of footprints in the dust, leading from the road toward the tree line behind the station, that stopped abruptly, as though the person had stepped carefully backward in their own tracks to hide where they went next. The situation reached its most disturbing point near the end of the month, when a heavy fog rolled through the valley late one evening, turning the entire clearing into a gray blur, where the trees looked like dark silhouettes against the mist. And sometime around midnight, I woke to the unmistakable sound of slow footsteps moving across the gravel directly outside the cabin door. The footsteps stopped just short of the porch steps, and remained there for a long time without moving, long enough that I began to hear the faint sound of breathing through the thin wooden wall. And I remember sitting perfectly still in the darkness, with the radio in my hand, debating whether to call for help, even though the nearest ranger was hours away. But before I made a decision, the footsteps slowly retreated across the gravel and disappeared into the fog beyond the porch light. When morning finally came, I walked outside, expecting to find footprints in the damp ground, but instead what I found was something even stranger, because about 30 yards down the road where the fog had thinned, there was a single vehicle parked partially hidden between two trees that hadn't been there during the night, and the driver's seat was empty with the door hanging open, as if whoever arrived had stepped out and walked toward the station sometime before dawn. Yet when I checked the surrounding area, I couldn't find a single footprint leading away from the truck, in any direction. "What are you in front of, a Carol and friends?" Which meant that whoever had been standing outside my cabin in the fog the previous night had somehow returned to that vehicle without leaving any visible trace at all. During my 4th year working for the National Park Service, I was assigned for 2 months to a small seasonal ranger station in the eastern section of Great Basin National Park in Nevada. A place so remote that the nearest paved road was over 20 miles away, and the dirt access road wound through miles of sagebrush valley before climbing slowly into the foothills of the Snake Range, where the station sat alone in a clearing of twisted pinyon pine and juniper. And unlike most ranger stations, this one had originally been built decades earlier as a fire lookout support cabin, meaning it wasn't designed for regular visitors, and had only a single-room office, a small bedroom, and a radio tower mounted beside a weathered shed where emergency equipment was stored. And because the station existed mostly to monitor backcountry activity along several unofficial trails used by experienced hikers, the job usually involved long, quiet days watching the distant mountains through binoculars and recording occasional radio traffic from the main visitor center far across the desert. For the first few weeks, my routine was so uneventful that I began to lose track of the days entirely because the silence out there was constant, broken only by the wind moving across the valley or the faint hum of the generator behind the cabin. And sometimes at night, I would sit outside under a sky so clear it looked almost artificial, listening to coyotes calling somewhere far off in the hills. But about halfway through my assignment, a series of small things started happening that I couldn't easily explain. And the first one was so minor, I nearly dismissed it, because one morning while checking the supply shed, I noticed that one of the metal lockers containing spare radio batteries had been left slightly open, even though I distinctly remembered closing it the previous evening before locking up the station for the night. At first I assumed I had simply forgotten to latch it properly, but when I inspected the inside, I realized one battery was missing from the rack and sitting on the workbench nearby, as if someone had taken it out and then decided not to keep it, which made little sense because no one had officially visited the station in over a week, and the closest trailhead was miles away, across rough terrain that very few hikers used during the late summer heat. I radioed the main office to ask whether another ranger might have stopped by while I was on patrol the previous day, but they confirmed that no one had been scheduled to travel anywhere near my location. And although the missing battery eventually turned up inside a storage crate where I must have accidentally placed it earlier, the uneasy feeling lingered because I couldn't remember moving it there at all. 2 nights later, I woke around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of gravel shifting somewhere beyond the cabin walls, a slow crunching noise that suggested a vehicle rolling across the dirt clearing outside the station. And when I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, the valley was completely dark, except for the weak glow of the moon over the mountains, yet the dust in the beam of the light drifted slowly, as if something heavy had passed through moments earlier. The next morning I found tire tracks on the far edge of the clearing that hadn't been there before, a narrow set of prints from what looked like an older pickup truck that had approached from the direction of the access road but stopped well short of the station itself before turning around and heading back down the valley. And what struck me as strange immediately was how the tracks curved slightly, as though the driver had been circling slowly to look at the building without actually coming close enough to be seen clearly from the windows. Over the following week, those same tracks appeared several more times, always during the night, and always stopping roughly the same distance from the station before disappearing again toward the desert road. And although it was possible someone had simply gotten lost and turned around repeatedly, the pattern felt deliberate in a way that made the quiet nights suddenly seem less peaceful, because every creak of the cabin walls made me wonder whether a vehicle was sitting out there just beyond the darkness. Eventually, I decided to stay awake late one night to see if the visitor would return. So I turned off the porch light and sat quietly near the front window, watching the clearing through a small gap in the curtain, while the generator hummed behind the building. And around 1:45 in the morning, I finally saw movement, when a pair of headlights appeared far down the valley road, moving slowly toward the station, with their beams dimmed almost to nothing. The vehicle stopped about 200 yards away, exactly where the tire tracks usually ended, and from that distance I could barely make out the silhouette of what looked like an old pickup truck with a camper shell. But instead of approaching the cabin, the engine shut off and the lights went dark, leaving the truck sitting motionless in the middle of the desert clearing, while the wind moved quietly through the sagebrush. For nearly 15 minutes, nothing happened at all. Then the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, holding what appeared to be a pair of binoculars raised toward the station, as if they were studying the building from the shadows. I remember feeling an immediate wave of unease, because the person made no attempt to walk closer or call out for help. They simply stood there staring through the binoculars, while the desert wind pushed dust across the ground, around their feet. And after several minutes, they climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and drove slowly away, without ever coming within shouting distance of the porch. I reported the encounter to the park dispatch the following morning, and gave them the best description I could. But since the truck never entered the restricted station area, and the driver hadn't threatened me, there was little they could do except note the incident in the patrol log. And for a few days the valley returned to its usual silence, until another strange detail emerged. When I discovered that the motion sensor camera, mounted beside the radio tower, had captured several photos during the night, showing a figure walking along the tree line behind a station sometime after midnight. The photos were grainy, but clearly showed someone moving carefully between the juniper trees, only about 30 yards from the cabin, and the timestamp revealed that the images had been taken less than an hour after the truck had driven away. During the night I stayed awake watching the road, which meant the driver must have returned on foot from somewhere else in the valley after leaving the vehicle out of sight. Realizing that someone had been quietly walking around behind the station while I believed they were gone, made the situation feel far more unsettling, because it meant they had intentionally created the impression that they were leaving before approaching again from the darkness. Over the next several nights, I began hearing faint sounds around the station after midnight, such as the soft crunch of footsteps near the radio tower, or the quiet scrape of something brushing against the cabin wall. But every time I stepped outside with a flashlight, the area appeared empty, except for the vast dark valley stretching away toward the mountains. The tension finally escalated one windy evening when I returned from a patrol hike and found the shed door behind the station hanging slightly open, even though I was certain I had locked it before leaving that morning. And inside the shed, nothing seemed disturbed, except for a single item sitting on the workbench that definitely hadn't been there earlier, because it was a pair of worn binoculars with cracked rubber grips and dust clinging to the lenses, as though they had been carried across the desert for a long time. The binoculars were identical in shape and color to the ones I had seen the driver using through the window days earlier. And beside them on the wooden bench, someone had placed a folded piece of paper torn from a small notebook. And when I unfolded it, I found a crude pencil sketch of the ranger station, drawn from a distance, showing the cabin, the radio tower, and even the small generator shed behind the building. The drawing was surprisingly detailed for something made with a simple pencil. But what made my stomach tighten was the tiny mark near the porch, indicating a stick figure standing exactly where I often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset over the valley. And below that figure, someone had written a single word in shaky handwriting that simply said, "Alone." And when I walked back outside holding the paper in my hand, the desert around the station looked completely empty in every direction, except for one detail I hadn't noticed earlier. Because far across the valley road, barely visible through the heat haze rising from the ground, there was the same old pickup truck parked on a distant ridge, with its windshield reflecting sunlight directly toward the cabin, like someone inside was still watching through binoculars, even in the middle of the day. The most disturbing experience I ever had working for the Forest Service happened during a temporary assignment at a remote ranger station in the northern backcountry of Yellowstone National Park, a place so isolated that the station could only be reached by a rough service trail that wound nearly 30 miles through forest and geothermal valleys. And because the area was closed to most visitors, except for a few permitted backpackers each season, the job was usually considered one of the quietest posts in the entire park system, which is exactly why they send a single ranger there at a time for weeks at a stretch. And when I arrived in early September, The previous ranger handed over the radio logs and casually mentioned that the place sometimes felt strange at night because the surrounding forest was so dense that sounds traveled oddly between the hills. But at the time I assumed he was just talking about the normal noises of wildlife or distant thermal vents releasing steam. And during my first several days, the routine felt exactly like any other backcountry assignment, with long patrol hikes along the river trail, checking campsites for abandoned gear, recording weather data, and occasionally radioing the main station many miles away to confirm that everything remained quiet. The ranger station itself was a small wooden building sitting beside a narrow meadow, surrounded on all sides by thick lodgepole pine forest. And behind the building stood an aging radio tower along with a tool shed and a small corral left over from the days when rangers still used horses to patrol the area. And because the nearest established trail passed almost 5 miles away, most nights the only thing I heard after sunset was the wind moving through the trees and the distant howl of wolves echoing somewhere deep in the valley, which after a few days began to feel almost peaceful. The first sign that something unusual was happening appeared during my 4th night there, when I woke around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of gravel shifting outside the cabin door. A slow dragging noise that seemed too deliberate to be an animal. And when I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, the clearing was empty except for the pale grass shining under the moonlight. Yet the dust on the narrow path leading to the station looked recently disturbed, like someone had walked across it only moments earlier. The next morning I checked the area more carefully and discovered a set of faint footprints in the dirt near the tool shed that clearly belonged to a person wearing heavy hiking boots. And although hikers occasionally wandered into the back country without permits, it was extremely unusual for someone to approach a ranger station during the night without announcing themselves, so I radioed the main office to report the tracks just in case a lost camper might be nearby. But no missing hikers had been reported anywhere in that region of the park. Later that afternoon, I hiked several miles along the river trail searching for signs of anyone camping nearby, but the forest was completely empty. And when I returned to the station near sunset, I noticed something that immediately made me uneasy, because the wooden door to the equipment shed behind the building was standing slightly open, even though I had locked it before leaving that morning. Inside the shed, everything appeared normal, except for a small pile of cigarette ashes scattered across the workbench, despite the fact that smoking inside park buildings is strictly prohibited, and none of the rangers assigned to that station smoked at all, which meant someone had entered the shed while I was away and stayed there long enough to finish a cigarette before leaving without taking anything. That night I kept the porch light on longer than usual and sat near the window writing reports while occasionally glancing toward the tree line, where the forest pressed close against the meadow. And around midnight I heard what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere beyond the radio tower, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps moving slowly through the grass. But every time I stepped outside to investigate, the sound stopped instantly, leaving only the wind rustling the tall weeds. Over the next several days, similar things kept happening, such as discovering fresh footprints near the edge of the clearing in the morning, or hearing faint movement near the station late at night, without ever actually seeing anyone. And the pattern gradually created the uncomfortable sense that someone was approaching the station repeatedly from the forest, but always leaving before I could catch them in the open. The situation became far more unsettling one evening when I returned from a long patrol hike and noticed a pair of binoculars sitting on the wooden bench outside the cabin door, where nothing had been earlier that morning, and the binoculars themselves were old and heavily worn with cracked rubber grips and scratched lenses, as though they had been carried through rough terrain for years. But what disturbed me most was the direction they were pointing, because whoever placed them there had left them aimed directly toward the station windows, as if they had been used to watch the building from somewhere across the meadow before being set down deliberately where I would find them. I radioed the main ranger office again that night and reported the strange activity, but because the area was so remote and there were still no confirmed sightings of another person, they advised me to simply remain alert and continue documenting anything unusual until a patrol team could reach the station in a few days. which meant I would be alone there at least 2 more nights. That same evening, just after sunset, I decided to check the small motion camera mounted on the radio tower that was normally used to monitor wildlife moving through the clearing. And when I reviewed the recent photos on the memory card, I felt a cold wave of realization pass through me, because several images taken during the previous night clearly showed a figure standing at the far edge of the meadow, partially hidden behind a tree, while holding a pair of binoculars raised toward the cabin. And although the person's face was too dark to identify, the timestamp revealed that they had remained in that exact spot for nearly 20 minutes before disappearing back into the forest. The next night, I stayed awake intentionally, with the interior lights off so I could watch the clearing without being seen from outside. And sometime after 1 a.m., I finally noticed movement near the same tree where the camera had captured the figure before, because a dark silhouette stepped out from the shadows and stood quietly at the edge of the meadow, holding something up to their face that reflected the faint moonlight like glass lenses. The person remained there for several minutes observing the cabin before slowly retreating into the forest again without ever approaching closer. And although I considered running out after them, the reality of chasing an unknown stranger into miles of dark wilderness alone made that idea seem reckless. The following morning, I walked to the edge of the meadow where the figure had stood and discovered several cigarette butts pressed into the dirt beneath the tree, along with a narrow footpath leading deeper into the forest that clearly showed signs of repeated use. And as I followed that path for nearly half a mile, the trees eventually opened into a small hidden clearing where I found the rotting remains of an old hunting shack that must have been abandoned decades earlier. But inside the shack were unmistakable signs that someone had been living there recently, including a pile of blankets, several empty food cans, and a crude wooden shelf holding 3 different pairs of binoculars arranged neatly beside a small notebook. When I opened the notebook, the pages were filled with rough pencil sketches of the ranger station, drawn from various angles around the meadow, and several pages included handwritten notes describing times when the porch light turned on or off during the night, along with brief observations about when I left the building to check the weather station or walk down the trail for patrol hikes, which meant that whoever had been staying in that shack had been quietly watching my daily routine for days without me ever realizing it. I hurried back to the station and radioed the main office immediately requesting assistance, but because the terrain made travel slow, they told me it would take several hours before another ranger team could reach my location. So, for the rest of that afternoon, I remained inside the cabin with the doors locked, listening to every sound coming from the forest beyond the clearing. As evening approached, the wind began to rise through the trees, making the radio tower hum faintly, while long shadows stretched across the meadow. And around dusk, I noticed something that made my heart start pounding, because far beyond the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, there was a figure, standing partially hidden among the pines, holding what looked like a camera or binoculars, pointed directly at the cabin again. The person didn't attempt to approach or run away when I stepped onto the porch, but instead remained completely still, watching from the shadows for several seconds before slowly backing deeper into the forest until the darkness swallowed them completely. The other rangers eventually arrived just before midnight and searched the shack and surrounding trails for hours, but found no sign of whoever had been living there, except for the abandoned supplies and the notebook filled with sketches of the station. And although they assumed the person must have fled when they heard the helicopter approaching earlier that evening, one detail from the camera footage we reviewed later has never stopped bothering me, because one of the final images taken shortly after the rescue team landed shows a figure standing far beyond the edge of the clearing, deep in the forest, holding binoculars and watching the station from a distance, even while the other rangers and I were outside talking under the floodlights, completely unaware that someone was still out there observing everything we were doing.